Now, I see someone ready to jump into the pool of Bethesda. Please.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk extremely, and you wear your considerable learning very lightly. I'm not sure if you were here this afternoon for the first talk of the day, or the earlier talk, but during that one, there was enough unease with how to think about anger that in fact we never get on to sloth. Others might disagree with what this controversy consisted of, but my recollection or my interpretation of it was that following therapeutic, psychoanalytic models, that some in the audience felt that, perhaps along with Abba Isaias, that anger of itself was not a sin, but that anger might be properly or improperly used. That if one repressed anger in the name of a Christian struggling with the unruly passions, that this was not necessarily a good thing. This perhaps was a bad thing. Better to express anger. And the speaker said one thing that I found quite illuminating, which is he said some people, he found that dealing with some people, what he needed to do was urge them to get in touch with their anger, and with others he found himself moved to say, cut it out, stop doing that. I'm wondering if, say, the difference between Evagrius and Isaias may have been one of these differences of either of personality or perhaps of context. Perhaps Evagrius found that there was entirely too much acting out of the unruly passions in a harmful way, and that Isaias found perhaps that there was too much repression of what properly directed would be a healthy and therapeutic passion. Do you have a view on that?
Yes. Thank you. Briefly, to summarize the question, I was asked whether I was here this afternoon, whether I heard all that was said by this afternoon's speaker, and whether I agreed with what was being said about anger, and more particularly, the questioner just now said perhaps partly it depends on the context, and that in some situations you might tell people to eliminate their anger, in other cases to act it out but in a positive way. And that might depend on the context and on the person you were dealing with. When in doubt, tell the truth is a good principle. So I have to tell the truth is that I did miss most of this afternoon's presentation, to my regret, but I unfortunately was detained by other tasks. I would have liked to have heard the presentation. I think, yes, we have to allow, first of all, for the way words are being used. We shouldn't concentrate just on the one word, anger, but we should look at the way in which it is being used by a particular person or in a particular passage. We shouldn't become fixed narrowly on the particular word, but we should look at the total meaning. And secondly, I do agree definitely that you have to allow for the context. You have to allow for the verbal context if you're looking at a written passage. You have to allow for the human context if you're dealing with a particular person or persons, yourself or someone else. And the counsel that you give will not necessarily be the same for every person. This is why the Orthodox tradition has not, on the whole, tried to produce systematic manuals of moral theology, where theoretical cases are argued and you're given a series of principles to apply and practical rules. We don't like to systematize our moral theology. That doesn't mean we espouse situation ethics. It doesn't mean that anything goes. But it does mean that we are concerned with persons and not with abstract rules. And hence the great importance that is attached within the Orthodox tradition to the spiritual father or the spiritual mother, to the counselor or guide in the spiritual way, who need not necessarily be a priest. But what matters is that we talk about our inner life with someone personally who can judge our specific situation and give the kind of advice that is suited to it. So the context is extremely important. I certainly would not want to say that anger is in itself sinful, but what we do with our anger has to depend on particular persons, and therefore what we say to people about how to use and come to terms with their anger would again depend on the person who was before us, and we'd have to talk with them and find out about what was going on in their inner and their outer world before we offered an answer. But I would put it this way: the anger may be negative, destructive in its expression, but behind the anger there is usually an energy which needs to be redirected. And so simply to tell people to repress their anger is usually not a sufficient answer. They've got to find ways of using the energy that will be creative and affirmative. Whether you call the energy anger or not may depend on the way you choose to use the words. But fundamentally our strategy needs to be affirmative, not simply to say mortify, destroy, but rather to say transform. That I suppose behind this lies a view of the human person which says that our basic impulses implanted in us by God are good, and what we need to achieve is not simply the negating of those impulses, but rather the faithful and true living out of them. That would be my approach, but I don't speak, obviously, as a psychologist or a pastoral counselor. I speak as a student of the Fathers, but also as a parish priest on the basis of my experience over 32 years now of hearing confessions. Yes, please.
Several times in the Psalms, the psalmist says that, or reveals his passions as affecting different parts of his body. Could you comment on that?
Yes. Clearly, some passions are associated with particular parts of the body. The passion of, here I'm using the sinful passion of gluttony or greed, obviously is so associated. Feelings of fear, though that's not exactly a passion, can hit us in the stomach. lower part here. Obviously, feelings of lust have a particular physical center, but that would not be true of all the passions. I mean, some passions are more intellectual, like envy or pride, and they are not necessarily associated with a particular part of the body. So clearly there's a certain gradation of passions, and Evagrius, using passion in the negative sense and discussing the 8 evil thoughts, says that the more physical ones are the ones that afflict us more in our youth, such as lust and gluttony. In middle age, we are more likely to be affected, he says, by anger and perhaps by avarice. Young people are often very generous with their material possessions. Middle-aged people are often rather mean and begin saying, well, I've got to save up for my old age. And he would see, I think, things like ambition as being perhaps more a mark of people in their middle age. Then he says that the characteristic weakness and passion of old age is pride. Well, that might not be true of everyone, but it's interesting as a graduation that he sees moving away from the more physical passions to the more intellectual passions.
Did you said this?
This is our friend Evagrius of Pontus, who didn't eat lettuce for 15 years. Yes.
In Eastern philosophy, the idea of balance seems to come out quite strongly as well, with yin and yang ideas like that. How do we as Orthodox, or what protection might we have as Orthodox that keeps us safe from falling too far into balance without remembering what the object of our mission is here? How to keep God in the balance?
Yes. The danger to me of a model of balance is that it perhaps lacks proper dynamism. If one talks of moderation and balance, something of the fervor of the Christian life has gone, something of the thirst and enthusiasm. And clearly there is a sense in which balance is very important, that so often the truth, whether in words or in our life, lies not in affirming one thing, but in holding two different things in balance. But if we have only the idea of harmony, moderation, which is Aristotle's idea, the golden mean, somehow something of the fervor of the Christian vocation is lost. Something of the emphasis where we're told, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. In Orthodox moral teaching, there is no agreed minimum. There's only the maximum of sanctity, which we all fall short. Sometimes people ask you about Orthodoxy and say, well, tell me, what are the basic things which I would have to do if I became an Orthodox in order to be an Orthodox in good standing? And I say that is the wrong approach. Don't ask what is the minimum that I can get away with, but look at the saints, look at St. Seraphim, look at Archbishop John of San Francisco, look at our Lord Jesus Christ. And there's no agreed minimum which can enable you to say, I'm all right. We don't have a double standard with the rules that everyone must keep and then some higher counsels which you may aim at. There's no distinction between a pass degree and an honors course. Everybody has to take the honors course. And I think that is very important, that we cannot simply imagine that by achieving a certain balance we are okay. We've always got to be reaching forward. As St. Paul says in Philippians, forgetting the things that are behind, I reach forward to what lies ahead. And St. Gregory of Nyssa says that this reaching forward goes on even in the age to come. We have to keep moving. Is that a question? Yes?
Your Grace, keeping in mind the integrity of the human person that you were emphasizing, is it, I guess this is a yes or no question, if you want to make it so. Are the passions a unit? If one is out of order, can we assume that the others may be out of order?
Are the passions a unit, is the question.
A unity.
A unity. Are the passions a unity? Usually, yes is never adequate as an answer to a question. And I would say yes, but then I would want to qualify it. Everything is connected. When I was at school, our history master used to say to us, and he had a high-pitched voice, "It all ties up, you see, it all ties up." And that was the way he taught history, and it was an extremely good way of teaching history, because what he tried to show us was the way events were connected. And that basically is the attitude of the fathers towards both virtue and vice, that the virtues, though we may distinguish them and label them, are all connected and are in the end a unity. And once more, the same is true of the passions or the vices, that they are all connected together. And a lot of the writing in the book like the Philokalia about the vices or the passions is to show how they are connected and how we might not expect this to be the case, but they very often are. How people who are liable to pride then find that they fall into the sin of lust. And there is a connection between pride and lust, though it might not seem obvious to us. Perhaps I would develop that by saying what we are concerned with is life. And life is a unity. Life goes on. And though within our lives we distinguish different virtues or vices, yet in our life everything is connected in the living and continuing experience that we have as persons. We cannot make rigid separations. We can make distinctions, and unless we distinguish things, we can't deal with them. But we must not totally isolate them. So I would say, yes, there is an interconnection, both in the case of good and of evil, both in the case of virtue and of vice. And therefore the passions, whether understood in good or bad sense, are all linked up together. Yes, the back, please.
Speak of Christ passion, is that passion in the same sense of...
Yes, I've just...
Speak of Christ's passion, is that...
The question was, can we speak of Christ's passion in the same sense as what we have been discussing? No, not exactly. When we speak of the passion of Christ, there I think the word pathos means much more suffering. And it is used also in the plural, the pathi, the sufferings of Christ. And so there, of course, the word passion is being used in a rather different sense. And yet, if we look at the Greek root, it is connected, because as I mentioned earlier in my talk, a passion is, in its fundamental sense, something undergone passively, where we suffer something. So there's a connection, but when we speak of the Passion of Christ, obviously this is slightly different. There is, however, the question, did Christ, this was not your question, but it's a question worth asking, did Christ have passions? And here I would take as my guideline Hebrews 4:15. We do not have a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but one who was tempted or tested in everything just as we are, only without sinning. So there it is said that Christ was tempted in everything as we are. And therefore, presumably, he did feel the reality of the passions, at any rate as temptations, even if he didn't live them out. That Christ then did have passions such as we have. Some of the fathers make a distinction and say that some passions are to be considered blameless and other passions sinful, and therefore Christ would only have had the first kind of passion and not the second. This is quite a difficult area. The Gospels do not tell us, for the most part, what was going on inside the mind of Christ. They tell us about the miracles that he performed, the parables and teaching that he gave, the sufferings that he underwent on the cross, his resurrection. But very little is said about the inner life of Christ. We are not in a position to write a psychological biography of Christ, because the Gospels do not tell us about that. We have occasional glimpses. For example, the Garden of Gethsemane, that Christ did feel real anguish before his coming passion, that he prayed intensely, let this cup pass from me, and that so great was his intensity of feeling that the sweat fell from him like great drops of blood. Now that is one of the very few glimpses that we get in the Gospels of what was really going on inside the mind of Christ. We today are very interested in psychological aspects of things, and we want to know all kinds of things about Christ, which in fact the Gospels don't say anything about. So I would stick to the principle in Hebrews that he was tempted or tested in everything as we are, that it shares the feeling of our infirmities. But I wouldn't want to try and explain that in detail, going beyond what the Gospels tell us. Dr. Dalek, you.
One of the other few indications is the story of Lazarus when he wept.
Thank you very much. I agree fully. One of the few other indications is at the story of Lazarus when Jesus wept. So there we do have a very clear indication that he felt feelings of human grief. And certainly he felt feelings of exhaustion. That is mentioned. Well, exhaustion is not purely psychological, it's both physical and psychological, but that he also clearly felt. How we understand the words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is very difficult. And yet surely those words are fundamentally important for our understanding of the death on the cross, that the sufferings of Christ on the cross were not merely physical, but clearly there was a spiritual anguish and even a sense of abandonment. That I find also important. But if we take the incarnation fully, then we can say to people who are suffering mentally, inwardly, that which you suffer has been shared by Christ. That's part of the meaning of the incarnation. That certainly I would want to affirm. Yes. Another question?
Yes, what was the eighth deadly sin that makes
What was the eighth deadly sin, the question was, that was left out so that Gregory the Great made 7 instead of 8? That's quite complicated. If you want to discover all about it, let me recommend you to get hold of the translation of the Ladder of Divine Ascent in the series The Classics of Western Spirituality. That's not the excellent translation that Father Lazarus made, but it was a translation made by someone called Colm Lubaid, and he was helped by Norman Russell. The Classics of Western Spirituality. Read the introduction, written by myself, a poor thing but my own, and there is a section there which tells you all about that. But basically, there are different ways of classifying the different feelings. I think St. Gregory the Great distinguishes pride and doesn't number it among the 7, but sees it as the root of all sins. And then sometimes there's a distinction made between akidia, axidy, which means listlessness, not exactly depression, because in confession I